The moment you stopped being controllable, you stopped being lovable, at least to them. Strange, isn't it? Studies show that most people don't actually fear change itself. They fear losing control in the process, and that's exactly what happened with you. The second you stepped outside their little box, they panicked like someone who just lost Wi-Fi mid-argument. Suddenly you weren't the problem child, the difficult one, or the black sheep. You were just someone who refused to be domesticated like a house pet in their emotional zoo. They didn't dislike you because of who you are. They disliked you because they couldn't program you. And now, they're finally realizing the truth they spent years avoiding. It was never you. It was always their obsession with control. Welcome to the unraveling. Number 1, control disguises itself as concern. Control disguises itself as concern, and that's the part that makes it so dangerous. People rarely come out and say, "I want to run your life." They package it in softer language, words that sound like love but feel like chains when you sit with them long enough. "I just want what's best for you. I'm only saying this because I care. Trust me, I know better." At first, those phrases sound protective, even comforting. But when you look closer, they're not about your growth. They're about your obedience. The truth is, control never announces itself as control. It sneaks in as advice, guidance, or tradition. It hides under culture, religion, family expectations, or even friendship. It tells you that stepping out of line is reckless, that wanting your own path is selfish, that saying no is disrespectful. And while you're busy second-guessing yourself, they sit comfortably knowing they've kept you in their grip without ever raising their voice. That's the art of control. It convinces you that their comfort matters more than your freedom. The problem is, concern without respect isn't love, it's manipulation. If someone truly cares, they'll offer their perspective and then leave you with the choice. But when concern becomes a weapon to guilt you, pressure you, or silence you, it stops being about care altogether. What they call concern is really fear. Fear of losing influence, fear of you outgrowing them, fear of you proving that their way wasn't the only way. The irony is, the more they wrap their control in "I care about you," the more it revealed the opposite. Real care doesn't shrink people, it expands them. Real care doesn't trap people in someone else's expectations, it helps them stand taller in their own truth. But because they couldn't say outright, "We don't want you to think for yourself," they masked it with a polished concern that looked noble on the surface and suffocating underneath. And now, when you pull back and see it clearly, it clicks. You were never the reckless one. You were never the ungrateful one. You were simply someone who refused to mistake control for love. And that refusal, that moment of clarity, is what broke their illusion forever. Number 2, the problem only existed when you refused their script. The problem only existed when you refused their script. That's the uncomfortable truth people don't like to admit. As long as you followed along, nodded your head and played your role, there was no issue. You were seen as cooperative, respectful, and even good. But the moment you stopped reciting their lines and started speaking your own, suddenly you became difficult, rebellious, or ungrateful. Nothing about you had changed except one thing. You stopped performing in the play they wrote for you. That's how control works. It doesn't demand your uniqueness. It demands your predictability. They wanted a version of you that they could manage, and so long as you stayed in that version, they felt secure. You could live, but only on their terms. The second you stepped off the stage and said, "I don't want this role anymore," they didn't know what to do with you. And instead of admitting they were threatened by your independence, they branded you the problem. It was easier to blame you than to face their own discomfort with your freedom. It's a clever tactic because it makes you question yourself. You start wondering if maybe you were being too harsh, too selfish, too stubborn. But the truth is, you weren't being any of those things. You were just being honest. And honesty looks like rebellion to people who thrive on control. They would rather label you difficult than confront the fact that they never wanted a relationship with the real you, only with the version of you that served their comfort. Here's the thing. People who truly care don't need you to follow a script. They don't panic when you think differently. They don't collapse when you say no. And they don't punish you for being authentic. They might disagree, but they still respect your right to choose. That's how you know the difference between love and control. Love survives your individuality. Control only survives your compliance. When you refused their script, you exposed the truth. The issue was never your behavior, your choices, or your dreams. The issue was that they couldn't direct you anymore. And the second you stopped letting them write your lines, the show ended. Not because you walked away from them, but because they couldn't handle the real, unscripted you. Number 3, their definition of peace was your obedience. Their definition of peace was your obedience. That's why the relationship always felt so one-sided. They spoke about wanting calm, harmony, and balance, but the truth is those things only existed when you were quiet, agreeable, and easy to control. The moment you expressed a different opinion, defended your boundaries, or dared to ask for something they didn't approve of, suddenly the peace was gone. Not because you created conflict, but because their version of peace required you to erase yourself. It was never real harmony, it was submission disguised as unity. As long as you carried the weight of silence, they could claim everything was fine. But fine for who? Fine for them, because their world stayed undisturbed. For you, it was suffocating. You were expected to swallow your truth, bury your frustration, and keep the waters smooth while they dictated the direction of the ship. That's not peace. That's control wearing a polite mask. What makes this so dangerous is how normal it feels when you're in it. They condition you to believe that disagreeing means being disrespectful, that saying no means you don't care, that standing your ground makes you selfish. Over time, you start second-guessing yourself, wondering if maybe you are the one disturbing the balance. But real peace doesn't demand silence. It allows for voices even when they don't align. The irony is that your presence was never the threat. Their fragile grip on authority was. They couldn't handle a version of peace where everyone had equal say because that meant they couldn't control the outcome. They wanted quiet, not understanding. They wanted compliance, not compromise. They wanted you still, so they could move freely without having to consider your truth. And here's the part they don't want to admit. If the only way peace exists is through your obedience, then it was never peace to begin with. It was dictatorship with a smile. The moment you realized that, the game was over. You weren't destroying harmony. You were exposing the fact that harmony never existed. They weren't afraid of conflict. They were afraid of your freedom. Because the second you chose authenticity over obedience, they lost the only kind of peace they ever knew, the kind built on keeping you small. Number 4, your freedom made their illusions collapse. Your freedom made their illusions collapse because their control only ever existed in your cooperation. They built an entire narrative around who you were supposed to be, how you were supposed to act, and what role you were supposed to play. For years they convinced themselves that the story was real, not because it reflected truth, but because you didn't challenge it. Their authority, their superiority, even their sense of stability depended on you staying in character. The moment you stopped reading from their script, the curtain fell, and everything they believed about themselves crumbled with it. This is what unsettled them most. You weren't breaking rules, you were breaking illusions. You didn't destroy anything that was real, you only refused to keep pretending. That refusal revealed how fragile their control always was. It wasn't strength holding everything together, it was performance. Once you stopped acting, the structure they built around you dissolved like paper in water. They weren't angry at rebellion, they were panicking at exposure. When someone relies on control, they live off the image of being in charge. They tell themselves they know best, that they're the guide, the protector, the authority. But your freedom tore that image apart. By choosing your own direction, you proved that their power wasn't natural, it was staged. You showed that they weren't the authors of your story, just editors trying to cut out the parts that didn't suit them. And when you refused their red pen, their identity as the one in charge collapsed. This is why they reacted so strongly. It wasn't about you making different choices. People do that all the time. It was about you exposing the illusion that they were ever in control of you to begin with. And illusions don't die quietly. They fight, they lash out, they accuse. But in the end, the truth doesn't need defending. It only needs revealing. By walking out of their play, you didn't just gain freedom. You forced them to face a reality they had been avoiding. Their power was never real, it was borrowed. And now that you've stopped lending it to them, they're left with nothing but the silence of an empty stage. Number 5, they didn't want you free, they wanted you manageable. They didn't want you free, they wanted you manageable. That's the part that stings when you finally see it clearly. Love was never the issue, or at least not the kind of love they claimed. Because love, real love, lets you stretch, lets you grow, lets you become more than even you imagined. But what they offered wasn't love, it was a bargain. They would accept you only if you agreed to cut off the parts of yourself that didn't fit into their comfort zone. It was never about embracing you fully. It was about trimming you down, shaping you into a version that didn't overwhelm them, didn't challenge them, didn't make them feel small in comparison. Your dreams, too big, your voice, too loud, your vision, too disruptive. So they tried to sand you down piece by piece until you could fit neatly into the little box they had built in their mind. They wanted a version of you they could carry in their pocket, pull out when it suited them and tuck away when it didn't. The truth is, freedom terrifies people who depend on control. A free you is unpredictable. A free you is expansive. A free you forces them to confront their own limitations, and that's a mirror many people can't stand to look into. So instead of celebrating your independence, they rebranded it as danger. Instead of honoring your individuality, they called it rebellion. Instead of letting you fly, they clipped your wings and told you it was for your own safety. But deep down, you always knew something was off. Because the more you shrank, the more they praised you. And the more you expanded, the more they condemned you. That's not love. That's management. Love doesn't keep score of how much smaller you've become. Love stands in awe at how much bigger you're willing to be. And now that you've outgrown their pocket-sized version of you, the truth is exposed. They never wanted the full you because the full you was too vast to control. But that's their limitation, not yours. You were never meant to be carried. You were meant to be witnessed. And anyone who tries to shrink you into something manageable was never trying to love you. They were only trying to own you. Number 6, you were never too much, they were too limited. You were never too much, they were too limited. That's the secret hiding inside every insult they threw at you. When they called you too loud, what they really meant was they couldn't handle a voice that wasn't trained to whisper. When they said you were too strong, it was their way of admitting they had no idea how to coexist with someone who didn't need their permission to stand tall. And when they labeled you too ambitious, it wasn't a critique of your drive. It was a confession that their own imagination stopped where yours began. People often disguise their limits as your flaws. It's easier for them to point the finger at you than admit that their world is too small to hold your kind of energy. So they shrink your power into negative words, hoping you'll believe them and shrink yourself to fit back into their comfort zone. Because if you keep your volume low, if you dull your strength, if you tame your hunger, then they don't have to face the truth. It was never that you were too much. It was always that they were too little for the magnitude of you. The irony is that what they criticized is exactly what made you different. The loudness was your refusal to disappear. The strength was your way of surviving storms they couldn't have endured. The ambition was your refusal to accept ceilings they were content to live under. These weren't flaws, they were evidence of your depth. And instead of stretching themselves to meet you, they chose the lazy path, to cut you down and label you excessive. But the more they said you were too much, the more they revealed their own limits. Because people who have range, people who carry real substance, don't feel threatened by intensity. They can sit with it, respect it, and even celebrate it. Only those with shallow roots panic when someone shows up with depth. So when you hear those old accusations echo in your memory, flip them for what they truly were: confessions. Too loud meant your voice reached where theirs couldn't. Too strong meant your resilience shamed their weakness. Too ambitious meant your vision exposed how small they had chosen to stay. You were never too much. They were simply too limited to comprehend the full scale of you. Number 7, they confused your autonomy for rebellion. They confused your autonomy for rebellion because in their world, independence is the same thing as defiance. You weren't trying to start a war, you were simply choosing your own direction. But to people who only understand relationships through control, every no sounds like an attack, every boundary feels like betrayal, and every act of self-determination looks like a declaration of war. That's why they overreacted when you made decisions for yourself. To them, obedience equals love, and compliance equals loyalty. So when you stepped outside of that equation, it wasn't just a choice in their eyes, it was treason. They couldn't grasp that you weren't rejecting them. You were just embracing yourself. The very idea of you not needing their permission was enough to shake the ground beneath them, because it revealed that the foundation of your connection was built on hierarchy, not respect. The saddest part is that they could have chosen differently. They could have built a relationship where your choices were honored even when they didn't align with theirs. They could have learned that autonomy doesn't erase love, it strengthens it, because love given freely is worth infinitely more than love extracted by pressure. But instead they treated your independence like disobedience, as if the only way to be connected to you was to control you. What they called rebellion was actually maturity. It was you stepping into your own authority, acknowledging that you have the right to your life, your voice, your path. It wasn't about proving them wrong or tearing them down. It was about refusing to erase yourself for the sake of their comfort. But because they've only ever known power dynamics, they mistook your self-respect for hostility. The irony is that real rebellion would have been fighting them, resisting for the sake of resistance, or trying to take their power away. But you didn't do that. You simply stopped handing yours over. And in their eyes, that loss of control felt like chaos. So no, you weren't the rebel they tried to paint you as. You were the one brave enough to live authentically. The war was never inside you. It was inside them, because they couldn't survive a relationship without dominance. Your autonomy wasn't an attack, it was freedom. And freedom will always look like rebellion to the ones who can't imagine life without control. Number 8. Your refusal to shrink was interpreted as threat. Your refusal to shrink was interpreted as a threat because people who rely on power need others to stay small in order to feel big. The moment you stopped bowing, the entire system they built around themselves began to wobble. You weren't trying to dominate, you were simply standing upright in your own truth. But in their eyes, that shift was unbearable. They couldn't see the difference between self-respect and arrogance because they've only ever measured worth in terms of hierarchy. If you weren't beneath them, you had to be against them. That's why confidence unsettled them so much. To someone who is secure, confidence is beautiful. It's a sign of growth, individuality, and strength. But to someone who thrives on control, confidence is a weapon, even when you're not using it as one. They mistook your voice for defiance, your boundaries for disrespect, and your self-assurance for rebellion, not because you were attacking them, but because you stopped giving them the submission they depended on. This is the trap. When people are conditioned to expect your compliance, the bare minimum of self-respect looks like hostility. A simple no feels like a declaration of war. A refusal to be belittled feels like insubordination. They couldn't imagine a relationship where equality existed, so the only way they could interpret your stance was as competition. In their mind, if you weren't beneath them, then you were trying to rise above them. There was no category for standing beside them. The irony is that you weren't threatening them at all. You were liberating yourself. You weren't trying to prove you were better. You were proving to yourself that you were enough. But because they lived in a world of domination and submission, your independence translated as a direct challenge to their authority. It wasn't your growth that scared them. It was what your growth revealed about their limits. By refusing to shrink, you didn't make yourself larger than life. You simply allowed yourself to take up the space that was always yours. And that act alone felt like defiance to people who only feel safe when others stay small. You didn't choose war, you chose dignity. But to those addicted to control, dignity is the most dangerous threat of all. Number 9. They tried to pathologize your power. They tried to pathologize your power because labeling you crazy or unstable was easier than admitting you were simply no longer under their control. Power, when it isn't theirs, becomes something they have to make dangerous. They couldn't call you strong, so they called you difficult. They couldn't call you independent, so they called you disloyal. They couldn't call you free, so they called you reckless. Every insult was less about you and more about protecting the illusion of their authority. It's an old tactic. If they can't silence you, they'll try to discredit you. They'll attack your credibility, question your sanity, and paint your decisions as proof that you've lost your way. And here's why, because if others believe you're unstable, then nobody has to take your truth seriously. If others believe you're disloyal, then your boundaries become betrayal instead of self-respect. If others believe you're crazy, then your clarity gets rewritten as chaos. It's not that they believed their own accusations, it's that they hoped others would. But the irony is that every label they threw at you only exposed how fragile their authority truly was. If their control had been real, they wouldn't have needed to weaponize words to keep you in line. If their influence had been genuine, your independence wouldn't have shaken it. The fact that they had to demonize your power revealed that their leadership was never built on strength. It was built on domination, fear, and performance. The truth is, they were terrified of what your power represented. It wasn't instability, it was clarity. It wasn't disloyalty, it was sovereignty. It wasn't madness, it was refusal. And that's what they couldn't stomach. Because once you stop complying, their role as the authority collapses. You showed that their power was never inherent, it only existed as long as you agreed to play along. So they tried to twist the narrative, they tried to make your strength look like weakness, but what they failed to realize is that accusations don't change reality. You weren't the unstable one, you weren't the disloyal one, you weren't the crazy one. You were the one who broke the spell, and their desperate attempt to pathologize your power was the loudest confession that their control was already gone. Number 10. Your existence without permission was their nightmare. Your existence without permission was their nightmare because it shattered the foundation of how they related to you. They had grown comfortable believing that your worth was tied to their approval, that you needed their validation before you could move, speak, or shine. As long as you operated within that system, they felt secure because your dependence kept them relevant. But the moment you proved that you could exist loudly without waiting for their green light, the illusion collapsed. You were no longer their project, their puppet, or their proof of importance. You were free. And freedom is terrifying to people who only understand influence through control. They weren't scared of your words, your choices, or even your power. They were scared of what those things meant, that you didn't need them to define you. For people who feed off control, irrelevance is the ultimate fear. You stripped them of that relevance the second you showed that your identity wasn't built on their permission slip. This is why your confidence shook them more than your defiance ever could. When you stopped asking for approval, you robbed them of the very currency they used to manipulate you. Every time you chose to stand tall without waiting for their nod, you were declaring that your life was your own. And they couldn't stomach that. To them, independence wasn't strength, it was betrayal. Not because it was wrong, but because it revealed how unnecessary their grip had always been. The truth is, nothing scares a controller more than being unneeded. As long as you looked to them for validation, they could pretend to be the authority. But once you stopped, they had no role left to play. And instead of admitting that your independence was healthy and natural, they twisted it into arrogance, selfishness, or defiance. They needed to demonize your freedom because it exposed their emptiness. But here's the unshakable reality. Your existence was never supposed to be conditional. You were never meant to live half alive, waiting for approval slips to breathe fully. By existing without permission, you didn't just claim your space. You reclaimed your life. And that act alone was enough to turn their comfort into chaos. Because the truth they feared most is the one you embodied effortlessly. You don't need anyone's validation to be undeniable. Number 11. They didn't lose control of you. They lost the illusion they ever had it. They didn't lose control of you. They lost the illusion they ever had it. That's the part they can't admit out loud. For so long, they convinced themselves that you were under their grip, that your choices, your silence, and your compliance were proof of their authority. But the reality is you were never truly bound. You were cooperating, sometimes out of love, sometimes out of survival, and sometimes out of habit. What they mistook for control was really your willingness to play along. The shift came when you decided to stop performing. That's when the illusion cracked. You weren't suddenly breaking free, you were simply showing that you'd been free all along. Their rules, their expectations, their attempts to box you in only worked because you let them. And once you stopped letting them, the facade collapsed in an instant. What they lost wasn't power over you, it was the fantasy that they ever had it. That's why their reaction felt so extreme. They weren't just angry at your independence, they were embarrassed by the exposure. Nothing stings more than realizing the leash you thought was iron was actually made of paper. They had built their identity around being in charge, around being the one who called the shots. and your refusal revealed that role was nothing more than an act they were performing for themselves. The truth is, control is only ever an illusion. No one can truly own another person's will, no matter how much they demand obedience. At best, they can convince you to dim yourself, but even then the power is still yours, because you can always choose to stop dimming. That's what you did. And that simple choice rewrote the entire story they were telling themselves about who held the reins. In the end, they didn't lose control of you because they never had it in the first place. What they lost was comfort, certainty, and the ego boost of believing you were theirs to direct. What you gained was clarity, the awareness that their grip was never real and your freedom was never negotiable. The illusion was theirs, the truth was yours, and the moment you revealed it, the game was over. Number 12. They called it betrayal, but it was liberation. They called it betrayal, but it was liberation. That's the trick of control. It flips the narrative so that your survival looks like sin. The moment you chose to walk away, they framed it as disloyalty, as if your duty was to remain loyal to a system that was suffocating you. They wanted the story to be about your unfaithfulness, not about their refusal to let you breathe. But the truth is simple. You weren't betraying them. You were rescuing yourself. The word betrayal is powerful because it carries shame. It makes you second-guess your choices, makes you wonder if you really were too selfish, too harsh, too ungrateful. But ask yourself, what kind of loyalty is it if it requires your silence, your erasure, your suffering? That's not loyalty, that's captivity. They weren't asking you to stand with them. They were asking you to kneel. And when you refused, they cried betrayal to cover the fact that their version of love was really just ownership. Walking away was never about hurting them. It was about saving yourself from the slow poison of shrinking. It was about choosing life over performance, truth over illusion, and freedom over bondage. They couldn't see that because their vision of loyalty is one-sided. It only counts when it benefits them. The second loyalty meant honoring yourself. It became a crime in their eyes. But liberation doesn't need their approval to be valid. Leaving the cage doesn't make you a traitor, it makes you alive. They can call it betrayal all they want, but the labels don't change the reality. You didn't stab them in the back. You pulled yourself out of their grip. You didn't abandon them. You stopped abandoning yourself. The irony is that if they had truly loved you, your liberation wouldn't have felt like loss to them. It would have been something to celebrate, even if it scared them. But because they were more invested in control than connection, they could only interpret freedom as betrayal. And that's the clearest proof of all. You didn't break something sacred by leaving. You revealed it was never sacred in the first place. Your so-called betrayal was the doorway to your wholeness, and wholeness will always be liberation. Number 13, their anger was just grief in disguise. Their anger was just grief in disguise, and once you see it, the entire picture makes sense. They weren't truly angry at you for being yourself. They were grieving the loss of the version of you they believed they could shape, mold, and control. For so long they held on to an image of who you should be, quieter, smaller, more obedient, more dependent. That image became their comfort. It gave them the illusion of certainty, the belief that your life would always bend around their expectations. When you broke away from that image, it wasn't just your independence that shook them. It was the death of their fantasy. And like all grief, it came with denial, rage, and blame. Instead of admitting they were mourning the version of you that never truly existed, they lashed out at the real you standing in front of them. They couldn't accept that their dream of shaping you had expired. So they disguised their grief as anger, directing it at you as though you had stolen something from them. But the truth is, you didn't take anything away. They were never entitled to ownership of your path. What died wasn't reality, it was their illusion of control. That's what they were clinging to, and when it slipped through their fingers, the loss felt unbearable. So they raged, they accused, they sulked. They wore anger like armor because admitting grief would mean admitting they never had the right to design your life in the first place. And here's the bitter irony. The person they thought they could make you into was always a ghost. It wasn't you, it wasn't real, and it was never sustainable. You were always going to grow into yourself, and that growth was always going to dismantle their dream. The anger was never about your truth. It was about their inability to accept it. So when you faced their rage, what you were really witnessing was mourning. mourning for the puppet they couldn't keep on strings, mourning for the character in their story who refused to play along, mourning for the comfort of believing they had more control over you than they actually did. Their anger was just grief with a mask on, grief for a version of you that was never meant to survive. Number 14. You proved that control was their addiction, not your problem. You proved that control was their addiction, not your problem. That's why no matter how much you adjusted, explained, or tried to meet them halfway, it was never enough. They kept moving the goalpost, finding new ways to criticize, new reasons why you weren't doing things right. They made it seem like you were broken, like you were the one in need of fixing, but the truth is there was nothing wrong with you. The real sickness was their obsession with control. Control for them wasn't just a habit, it was a dependency. It gave them a sense of safety, identity, and superiority. Without it, they didn't know who they were. That's why your independence rattled them so deeply. It wasn't just that you said no. It wasn't just that you wanted something different. It was that every choice you made outside of their grasp exposed the fact that their entire system only worked when you surrendered. You pulled back the curtain, and what stood behind it wasn't authority. It was desperation. They called it guidance. They called it love. They called it protection. But if it were any of those things, it would have allowed you to breathe. It would have respected your voice. It would have celebrated your individuality instead of suffocating it. What they offered wasn't love at all. It was dependency masquerading as care. They didn't want connection, they wanted control. And when you stopped feeding their addiction, they spiraled. That's the danger of someone addicted to power. They will twist reality until you believe you're the one causing the chaos. But you weren't chaotic. You were simply free. You weren't rebellious. You were simply alive. Their system couldn't handle that because their entire identity depended on keeping you in check. By walking away from their grip, you shattered the illusion. You proved that you weren't the problem they were trying to fix. You proved that their need for domination was the real issue all along. And in doing so, you exposed the flaw at the center of their design. Control can never coexist with real love, respect, or connection. You weren't broken, you never were. What was broken was their system, and your freedom was the proof they could no longer ignore. The truth is, you were never the problem. You were simply the proof that their grip was never as strong as they believed. Every label they threw at you, every attempt to shrink you, every desperate move to rewrite your story was never about your flaws. It was about their fear. Your independence exposed the weakness in their system, your boundaries revealed the cracks in their power, and your freedom dismantled the illusion they had worked so hard to maintain. They wanted obedience and called it peace. They wanted compliance and called it love. They wanted ownership and disguised it as protection. But when you refused to shrink, refused to bow, and refused to betray yourself just to keep their comfort intact, the mask slipped. What they called rebellion was simply self-respect. What they called betrayal was simply liberation. What they called arrogance was simply you existing without apology, and that's the part they'll never admit. You weren't the one who failed them. They failed themselves by mistaking control for connection. You didn't destroy their system, you simply stopped fueling it. You didn't end the game, you just stopped playing it. And in that moment, everything they thought they had over you vanished. So let this be the reminder. Your power was never there to give, and it can never be theirs to take. You were never too much, you were never broken, and you were never in need of fixing. The only thing broken was the illusion that you were ever theirs to control. Now you stand as the evidence that freedom is louder than obedience, and truth lasts longer than illusion. You weren't their problem, you were their revelation. And revelations don't bow, they rise. If this message resonated with you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss more content like this. Like the video to show your support. Drop a comment to share your thoughts or experiences, and don't forget to share this with someone who needs to hear it right now. Your support helps this community grow, and together we rise louder, freer, and stronger. Stay blessed always.